Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on centering survivors, responding to the needs of Asian and Pacific Island survivors as a SART. This webinar is brought to you today by the Sexual Violence Justice Institute, which is a project out of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault in partnership with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And before we get started, I just want to say that for myself, this is the start of week 10 of working from home. It has changed the way that I think, the way that I work, the way that I collaborate. And I'm sure that that change in collaboration and communication is something that most of you can really relate to. Many of the teams and communities that I work with across the states and territories are kind of finally finding a little bit of footing in the middle of this haze. The individual disciplines within communities have put together their plans and changes and improvised protocols for working through this crisis, even though things are ever evolving. But now communities are really trying to make sure that all of those different pieces, all of those different disciplines are really fitting together, which can be hard, even in the communities with well-functioning long-term SARTs. So today we're going to take a little step back and think about something that is always important and maybe even more so given the state of our world right now. How can SARTs center the needs of victim survivors? We will not have all the answers today, but using the framework of learning more about the needs of Asian and Pacific Islander victim survivors, we can really think about the ways that we can strengthen our sexual violence response and better meet the needs of all victim survivors in our community. So I'm really glad that you're able to join us today for this exciting conversation. And so before we actually get started, before we really do the introductions, I just want to let you know a few different logistical things. Your phone lines will be muted for the entire conversation. I know that that can be hard, but I think we've all been on all the wonderful calls where too many voices have made it difficult to really learn. And so our conversations will mostly be used through chat. And so the chat will be monitored by SVGI staff, Fatima, who is our new rural projects coordinator here at the Sexual Violence Justice Institute, will be able to answer any and all of your questions that you might have coming in, and she'll also be kind of fielding them and holding some of them for the presenters throughout the conversation. If you have any other kind of needs, you can also email us at svgi@mincasa.org, and that will also be monitored throughout this call. And the perennial question is this webinar being recorded? Yes. The recording and the materials will be sent out afterwards, along with an evaluation, which we really hope that you are able to fill out and really give us some great input about how we can strengthen the materials that we provide to you, as well as some ideas about what really might be useful for you for future webinars and trainings from SVJI. And so that will be sent out probably within this week. And so now that you've heard my voice for a couple of minutes already, I want to introduce myself. I am Jolene Engelking. I am the Senior Rural Projects Coordinator at the Sexual Violence Justice Institute, which, as I mentioned, is a project out of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And even though we are based out of Minnesota Coalition, my work is primarily focused on working with all you folks across the states and territories through our OVW Rural Grant, which is what is bringing us this webinar today. And the Sexual Violence Justice Institute, in case you do not know, is focused on supporting communities to increase access to healing and justice for all victim survivors. And the way that we're most known is through our SART work and through our collaborative work. And so we're really glad you're able to be here today. And even though this world is strange and virtual, we do want you to know that we are still able to offer training and technical assistance to meet your needs. That can include resources, referrals, helping problem solve. I love virtually attending your meetings, reviewing protocols and different products you might have, and really whatever we can do to help your community enhance that collaborative response. And for some communities, even some early planning for future on-site visit where I get to know you and your community more in person. And so that is us for today, but I'm going to hand it over to the people who will be providing the primary content. And so our second host is Sarah, and she'll be introducing the institute that she works at. Oh, let's see if Sarah can be unmuted.
Okay,
Are you
thank
there,
you.
Sarah?
Can you hear me now? I am.
Yes, I
Can you hear
can.
me? Okay. Thank
Yes.
you, Jolene. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Khan, and I'm a project specialist with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. So the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, or API GBV, as we call ourselves, or sometimes just the Institute, we are a national resource center on domestic violence, sexual violence, trafficking, and other forms of gender-based violence in the Asian and Pacific Islander communities. We also analyze critical issues that affect API survivors. My role and the Institute's role, staff at the Institute provide training, technical assistance. We also conduct research, policy analysis, maintain a clearinghouse of information, and culturally specific models of intervention and community engagement. We serve a national network of advocates, community-based service programs, federal agencies, other organizations working to eliminate gender-based violence. And I'm really happy to be here today because, as you've said, in these troubled times, we've also noticed the spike in gender-based violence, in domestic violence and sexual assault, and also the disproportionate way in which the API populations, at least in some parts of this country, have been affected. So to that end, I would love to introduce you to our presenter for today, our Executive Director, Chick Dabby. Would that be the next slide, Jolene? Right. So Chick is our current Executive Director at the Asian Pacific Institute, and I'll let her introduce herself. Welcome, Chick.
I'm still muted.
No, we can hear you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I know. Hello, everybody. This is Chick Dabby. I'm at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and I have been the executive director there since we started. I'm about to retire. So this picture you see of me is going to look the same when I work as when I retire. I'll be gazing into some, beautiful landscapes, and I am looking forward. I've really been very honored to work at the Institute and to meet advocates all over the country and to address the issue of sexual violence. Next slide, please. So I will be talking about, hello, next slide. I'm going to be addressing these various topics. Next slide. And I'm going to start with an introduction about Asians, because generally we're a pretty large group, not homogeneous. We have a lot of differences between Asian communities and then within each Asian community. So, for example, I'm originally, Sarah and I are both actually from India originally, but we're from different regions in India. We speak different languages. So, for example, Sarah speaks Kashmiri because she's from Kashmir, but I don't speak it at all. And I'm from the southern part, from Bombay, so I speak Hindi, etc. So it's just a way to illustrate that within even any Asian group, there's a lot of diversity. So you have a very long list here. I'm just going to emphasize which groups are in fact are in the US, and so you might be likely to see them in your communities. And it's not important to know whether they're actually Central Asians or, to get the label right. But this is just a way of organizing how broad the diversity and the identities are. So from Central Asia, mostly what you would have are Afghan refugees and immigrants. From East Asia, all of them are here, mostly Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, and Tibetan. From Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. So these are all the groups that are spread across the territories, mostly in the US. There are some Native Hawaiians, Samoans, and Tongans. So these are the, but there's a mix across the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander populations. Of course, they're all spread out in the territories, but in the US, these are the specific groups you would find. Southeast Asia, almost all these groups are found in the US, but in high numbers. There are Burmese refugees, Cambodians, Filipinos, Hmong, and Thai, and Vietnamese. Next slide, please. So continuing on, in South Asia, we have Bangladeshis, Bhutanese, Indians, Maldivians, Nepali, Pakistani, Sri Lankan. So all these groups are in the US. And to point to intra-Asian diversity, let me just bring up the Bhutanese refugees. So most Bhutanese refugees, well, almost all refugees live in camps in other countries before they come to the US. So they flee their home countries and live in camps and then come to the US. So Bhutanese refugees have been in camps in Nepal for many, many years. And so most Bhutanese in the US speak Nepali rather than Bhutanese. In West Asia, which is typically referred to as the Middle East, there are a lot of different countries, obviously, connected to that. The refugees that you largely see in the US and immigrants are from Iran, Iraq, Palestine, and Syria. So currently, these are the larger groups. And I just want to also mention that there are currently, we did a survey a couple of years back, and there are about 75 different Asian languages that are spoken within the different groups in the US. Next slide. So why do domestic violence programs address sexual violence? So initially, historically, many immigrant and refugee women in the US started organizing around domestic violence because they were seeing the impacts of domestic violence within the communities, and also because we were trying to come up with ways that we could mitigate some of the barriers that survivors in Asian communities faced. And we were also trying to understand what the trends and dynamics were in our own communities. So this organizing around domestic violence really then became a way for multiple programs to design themselves and establish themselves with the purpose of serving Asian and Pacific Islander groups. What started happening is that the advocates working with domestic violence survivors started hearing a lot about sexual violence. And that kind of led to some of these conclusions here that compartmentalized services were a barrier for Asian survivors. I mean, they're a barrier for any survivor, frankly. And once the survivors established some rapport with their advocate in the domestic violence program, then they were comfortable disclosing sexual violence. And many of these immigrant and refugee DV survivors had undisclosed histories of sexual violence in their home countries. And in addition to that larger landscape, there was also the issue of how sexual violence was treated within our own communities, typically with high levels of victim blaming, which meant that there was a real barrier and impediment to help seeking. And also by starting to address sexual violence, programs started to see that it was a way to counter the denial that this is a problem in our communities. And now, in the survey that we did, I think it was about 4 years ago, we see that 69% of domestic violence programs designed for and by Asians and Pacific Islanders now address sexual assault. Next slide, please. I want to add, as we move to the next slide, I want to add one more context factor, which is that is the current climate around COVID-19. So you may or may not have heard that there's been an increase in anti-Asian hate crimes and hate violence and racism, and some of it's been very overt and openly attacking Asians, physically and also verbally. So in today's context, you know, this affects the work all of you do all the time, but for Asian communities, there is this added layer of racism, which is going to have an impact on help-seeking behavior. So looking at definitions, I want to just mention these three different definitions and what they emphasize. So the first definition emphasizes what is experienced in sexual assault. So it's experienced as invasive and violation of bodily integrity. The second definition just refers to any sexual act. So it emphasizes what, so any range, any type of sexual act. It talks about the different means that might be used, the different strategies, coercion, and by who sexual violence is perpetrated, so regardless of their relationship to the victim, and then where it happens. So here you see what the acts are, what the means are, who the perpetrators can be, and where these abuses might occur. And then in the third definition, this is the legal definition of rape in the US that was modified and revised in 2013 to address, to revise the old ideas of sexual violence as just constituting vaginal penetration and rape. So this, and also just, this also makes it not only applicable, this definition, this revision to the definition then also includes male victims of rape in the gay and other contexts. Okay, so next slide, please. So here's some little bit of data, some snapshots. So this was a study done in actually Asia and the Pacific Islands, where 10 to 62% of men, so this was a study with men, and it was a very well done study. So the data is very credible and very well obtained. And what's reported in the study is this percentage you see, that 10 to 62% of men reported that they had perpetrated rape in their lifetime. And what's disturbing is that half of those men had perpetrated before they were 20, so whilst they were teenagers. So this statistic about victimization, well, we know victimization starts early with sexual assault, but this also confirms that perpetration starts early. And this is not just so in Asian communities, but victimization and perpetration starts early in all groups. In the US data for US women has the same conclusion. Next slide. And then here's another statistic about about physical and sexual violence perpetrated against a partner. This is again Asian Pacific Islander data. And what this lets us then see is that given how many survivors we're seeing here are can be immigrants and refugees, that they would have high levels of domestic violence and sexual violence, gender-based violence. They would have significant numbers would have histories of gender-based violence in their home countries that mostly they would not have dealt with. Next slide. So here's just some data on US, Asian Pacific Islander women in the US. The NISVIS study by the CDC is comparable to what other Asian women experience, so 1 in 3 women. And in the second statistic, this is a study done by the Institute where we interviewed Filipina and Indian and Pakistani women who were survivors of domestic violence. And this is the data: 56% said they had experienced sexual assault by an intimate, and 64% of Indian and Pakistani women said the same. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to sort of shift and talk a little bit about, sorry, I lost my, so I'm going to talk about culture and lifetime violence, and I'm going to integrate that discussion about abuse over the life course by pointing out some of the trends in Asian communities. Next slide. So I want to point out, so let's just start with this thorny notion of culture. Firstly, let me just say that culture exists in all communities. This is not just something that we find in Asian communities or communities of color or ethnic groups. So, and the way I like to address culture is to sort of break it down and remind us of these 3 domains of culture. The first domain is the culture of gender-based violence that most of us, all of us, live in and certainly do our work in. And this culture of gender-based violence is one that devalues women and girls, LGBTQ, gender non-conforming folks. It normalizes or minimizes abuse, blames victims, excuses abusers, ignores sexism, promotes aggressive masculinity. So that's just the broader culture we're all living in and certainly are doing our work within. Then we have the culture of ethnic communities. I want to clarify that we're talking about, when we talk about communities, there's not just ethnicity, they're based on identity as well. So LGBTQ groups have their own culture, deaf communities have their own culture. So rural cultures are different from urban cultures. Cultures on an army base are different from cultures in urban areas or in the suburbs. So culture is this very rich tapestry. And within, ethnic and identity specific cultures, there are strengths and there are harms that they inflict. And we'll be obviously talking more about that as we go through this presentation. And finally, there's the culture of systems. And many of us in our work as advocates, we're also connected to systems. We partner with systems. Jolene, as Jolene mentioned in the introductory remarks, that SVJI really focuses on partnership and building systems together. And of course, that applies to SART teams too, because SART teams are a perfect example of the meaning and intention of partnerships that center survivors then. But we also know that systems culture can create barriers, withhold resources, and compound trauma, and of course, increase abuse or impunity. So, we're operating in all these 3 systems constantly. Next slide, please. And I'll just turn to, but we'll be talking today about Asian and Pacific Islander communities. So, of course, we cannot talk about culture without remembering to mention its riches, the wealth it brings us. So cultural identities contain the histories of people that include traditions and struggles and achievements and triumphs. And they nourish pride, resilience, belonging, connection, intersection. Harms are what we see in our work all the time, which is how traditional patriarchal norms are maintained and enforced by violence, rejection, fear, threats, and in more subtle ways. So I want to just say a little more a clarification about patriarchy. So patriarchy typically gets sort of shorthanded to mean that it's about the oppression of women by patriarchal societies, by men. But I want to really point out that patriarchy and the cultural norms that patriarchy introduces and maintains are with the purpose of maintaining the status quo of power. And it's about maintaining the status quo of power between men and men, women and women, and women and men. And then also, as we see, between the more marginalized members of our communities and the more powerful ones. So queer members, people with disabilities, all the ones that serve in the marginalized groups and don't generally conform to a binary are also become part of this patriarchal structure, which is about maintaining the status quo. And we as social justice activists and so on are always trying to push back on that and change that. And cultural freeze refers to the way that immigrant and refugee communities, because of migration, because of disruption, severe dislocation, of course, from their home countries, here they hang on to old ideas about that culture. And they hang on even tighter sometimes the longer they've been here. So there may be very traditional ideas that people hang on to about their culture that existed in their home country when they first left, when they were living there and when they left. But some of these norms don't apply anymore, even in the home countries. But because people feel this enormous dislocation and they want to sort of transfer their cultural values, they hang on to culture in these very frozen aspects of culture. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to turn now to talking about the lifetime spiral of gender-based violence. And I will use this spiral. I know, of course, it's very small. The type is very small, and it's not meant to be kind of read in this PowerPoint. But I will use this and different stages across the lifetime to identify some of the trends that are typical to our communities. And I want to just mention that the reason for developing this grew out of what, as advocates, we were hearing from Asian Pacific Islander survivors, which was that they came to our domestic violence programs, but when they would also reveal and disclose all these histories of abuse that they had encountered before they came to the domestic violence program for help. So as advocates, we saw that in many of our communities, many women had lots of experiences, and domestic violence was what got them into the help-seeking agency that we represented, but in fact that they were dealing, and so we as advocates would also be dealing with a range of abuses that have an impact. And I'll talk a little more about the lifetime spiral, but first let's go through the trends. Next slide. So here, this is just a pullout of this life stage. Next slide. So what we see during this, what the trends are in this stage that affect infants and children are for infants, we know in many Asian communities, I don't know, I think this is more true of Asians and certainly not so of Pacific Islanders, but in many Asian communities, there's a huge son preference. And so boys are really valued, boy infants, and there's a very corresponding devaluation of girl infants. And this can, in terms of gender violence, can be both violence like selected abortions, but it can also be neglect, from giving less nutrition, less healthcare, less education for girls because of very entrenched cultural norms of misogyny and sexism. As for children, there's physical and sexual abuse by both family members and foster families, and this is true for all communities. This is not just necessarily applicable to APIs, but for our own communities, for API communities, there's exposure to sexual violence in refugee camps and conflict zones. And then, of course, again, there's domestic exposure to violence in the home. And this impact of the exposure to sexual violence in camps and conflict zones does impact both young girls and young boys in these camps, whether they're victims or observers. As we know, exposure it has very traumatic implications as well. And we have families where 4-year-old boys are impacted by, who are now adults or teenagers, or remember the impact of seeing their mother or their sister being raped during whilst they were in war zones in their home countries. So this has a long-term reverberating impact on the trauma. Next slide. So looking here at then teenagers or young adults. Next slide. So some of the trends that we see in young adults are, I know this is a long list, and I will try to give a brief explanation, but I will also emphasize some of these issues and how they're being addressed. So forced or early marriage, and this refers to the practice of parents arranging a forced marriage for their daughters, mostly minors. And this is different. Forced marriage is different from arranged marriages. In arranged marriages, they're not arranged for minor daughters, but essentially, and there's consent. So yes, of course, the consent can sometimes be constrained by family pressure and other factors, but it's so arranged marriages should not be conflated with forced marriages, and arranged marriages should not be seen as connected to sexual violence. So in forced marriage, often the parents are arranging a marriage, and the man can be a much older man. It can be a man, obviously, that their daughter hasn't met. And so connected to forced marriage is marital rape for the young women. There is an aspect of forced marriage that affects gay men in some Asian communities, because parents who are rejecting their gay children, their gay sons, will sometimes arrange forced marriages for them when as adults. So 25, 30-year-old men have also been trapped in forced marriages by their parents. There's a lot of work going on about forced early marriage, and a lot of the policy work and some of the advocacy work is, so the policy work is being done by Tahiri Justice Center, and a lot of the activism and advocacy work is being done by many Asian programs across the country, because we're seeing a lot of this both in immigrant and in refugee communities. There are also in the community severe prohibitions about dating, and these prohibitions really are a barrier to help seeking. And as I'm talking about trends, I would really urge all of you to think about how all these trends and dynamics affect help seeking, because as we know around sexual violence, there's a big aspect of our work is to promote help seeking, to provide ways that mitigate systems culture that can be harmful and can create barriers to help seeking. So these prohibitions to dating, so many young Asian women will talk about, and of course there are double standards because these prohibitions apply only to daughters, and they will then find themselves, when they find themselves in a relationship where that's abusive, it's really hard to go for help to family members because they're not even supposed to be dating, let alone be in a relationship where they're being abused. Incest disclosure is increasing, so we have no way of identifying what the rates of incest are. There isn't really any specific data about that, but again, because of the rapport that advocates have built with survivors, we're seeing a lot of incest disclosure increases, and this is both from advocates and community members and survivors and family members. There's a lot of parental silence about histories of child sexual assault. This applies to all groups. In Asian communities, the ignorance about sex and anatomy, I really want to point that out. It's not a form of identifiable abuse, so I don't want to call it that, but it really increases vulnerability to abuse. So many families in this notion of cultural freeze that I was talking about also are trying to hang on to, keeping these prohibitions about dating and sex and sexual understanding. And so this is done by keeping people in, keeping their children, especially, in great ignorance about sex and anatomy. And this increases both the vulnerability of survivors and community members, and it also increases sometimes or serves as a barrier to help seeking, because people are worried or ashamed because they don't really know what's happening to their bodies, and so this this ignorance is actually a very significant factor that plays into help seeking and even in advocacy. There's reproductive sabotage. We know this from in all different communities. Condom roulette is just an example of that. It refers to the game, if you will, or the abuse that's enacted by men, basically poking holes in condoms through that, just using a fine needle to push through a condom packet. And then when they open the packet, they're seen as, oh, they're so mindful and thoughtful and they have protections, etc. But in fact, because of the holes pierced in the condom, it can lead to pregnancy or STIs. So there are different ways that reproductive sabotage is enacted against young adults and teens. Pregnancy is severely is seen as a huge transgression, a pregnancy outside of marriage in many Asian communities, and leads to abuse, isolation, sometimes forced adoption. There's hookup abuse, and which people used to call dating violence. I really like using the term dating. It's not very relevant anymore. So there are many ways that hooking up describes the different ways that youth and teens are relating to each other, having relationships or situationships, or all kinds of different vocabulary that goes to express what the meaning of the relationship is. But what that can do is also then increase the vulnerability of both parties in understanding what's happening, or make it harder to identify when hooking up sort of crosses over into being abuse. There's female genital cutting, and sometimes referred to as female genital mutilation. This is practiced in a few Asian communities, not a lot, but the way that this could actually this would actually impact, your SART teams and your medical examiners, because you might be looking at a survivor of a rape or other form of sexual assault, but the anatomy would be, and that survivor's, genitals would be altered by this practice of cutting. And female genital cutting and mutilation is performed by a woman's family members, female family members. I just want to remind us how this practice fits into the definition that I had earlier, that it is acts directed against a person's sexuality. So again, many of these forms of abuse have multiple purposes and affect survivors in different ways. So again, LGBTQ identity or coming out can lead to severe parental rejection and can also increase vulnerability. Many youth are kicked out of their homes or become runaways. And what runaways have messaged to us as advocates is that the streets are safer than the home. And so we need to also then build that particular response to supporting the vulnerability of LGBTQ youth. There's harassment and assault by clergy and teachers and coaches. And I know there's been a lot of work and a lot of training done about the sexual violence perpetrated by clergy. What I want to make a comment about sexual violence by clergy is that, when people started speaking out about victimization by clergy, everyone believed them. They were largely adult men speaking out about sexual violence, and people didn't doubt them or accuse them of making it up or exaggerating or having false memory syndrome, any of the things, all the victim blaming stuff that so many women endure. So I want us to keep this in mind, that we know how to do a response. I mean, we, of course, as advocates know how to do this response, but our larger society has responded to sexual violence victimization without victim blaming, without disbelieving, and without, addressing and damaging the credibility of survivors. So there is a model for how we can address sexual violence, and because men are more credible victims than women and more credible survivors, we also need to then, in our community engagement work, keep this in mind and use it as a way, as a way to anchor how attitudes to survivors can be changed. And lastly, I want to just mention sex trafficking. So there's sex trafficking. Again, there's a lot of work being done on sex trafficking. I just want to point out that not all sex trafficking is pimp controlled, that it's family controlled, also controlled by intimate partners, by gangs, and by crime syndicates. And the nature of the violence depends on who the controller is and what's happening. So we can't go into that here, but I just want to make sure that people get that there are these different distinctions and there are different degrees of sexual violence perpetrated and maintained and enforced that depend on who the controllers are. Next slide, please. So this slide brings us to talking about sexual violence against adults. Next slide. Okay, so what are the trends that we see here in the community? And so, of course, there's rape, including marital rape, which is, is experienced by all groups. What is particular to Asian groups, not Pacific Islanders, but Asians here, is the abuse perpetrated by in-laws. So in dealing with domestic violence, what advocates saw very early on and have continued to address this issue is that domestic violence is not perpetrated only by an intimate partner, but also by male and female in-laws in the extended family home. So rape by in-laws is can be one of the types of abuse that women can encounter. So rape or different forms of sexual assault can be encountered in the home, both by the intimate partner, by the husband, and by the in-laws. Reproductive coercion, again, I'd mentioned it earlier, for adults, reproductive coercion in our communities, because of what I referenced earlier about son preference, can also lead to forced abortions or multiple pregnancies, as women are pressured to bear sons. So the son preference, despite whatever health risks there might be because of multiple pregnancies or repeated, very closely spaced pregnancies, the son preference is one factor in reproductive coercion that adult women encounter. Being forced to watch and mimic pornography. So we have heard from many Asian women. When I worked in direct services and worked a lot with direct service providers, we see this aspect in our communities. And as many of you know, pornography is no longer just sort of some eroticism. You know, it's not a portrayal of eroticism, it's really a portrayal of subjugation and women's subjugation and violence. And many, many people are now exposed to pornography. Boys are exposed to pornography from, the age of, some boys have been exposed from as early as 11. So this exposure to pornography, of course, affects the sexual violence that then adults perpetrate and experience. Being forced to tolerate infidelity, because many of our communities are immigrant communities, and the men might go back and forth between their home countries and the US, and they may have a second family in their home countries, or they may engage in sex tourism in their home countries and then infect their partners. But they also, this also means that women are forced to sort of tolerate infidelity by their partners. And again, this is not just happening in Asian API communities, but in a lot of communities. There's body shaming and body humiliation, where especially, in the extended family home, again, male and female in-laws may both participate in shaming women and humiliating women about their bodies, how their breasts are, how thin they are, how their shapes. I mean, what the vocabulary of body humiliation is, but it's really sexualized, and because it's also perpetrated by more than just the intimate. Marry and dump refers to, and transnational abandonment. These refer to the practices where, again, this is for Asian men, and we see this a lot in South Asian men, but in other groups too, where they get married and then dump their new bride very quickly. So marry and dump refers to the practice where somebody's dumped within 3 months maybe of getting married, and transnational abandonment is the same practice, but it's a longer chronological trajectory. So women couples who may be married for many years, and then suddenly she goes back to her home country for a vacation or something, and she can't return. her return is blocked, or her papers are rescinded, or her status is jeopardized, essentially. And so there's a lot of sexual shame component that is associated with this, because now women have been married, but then their husbands have basically abandoned and dumped them. Assault based on immigration status. So again, exploiting the immigration status of women. Fiancé visas or K visas refer to women coming to the US with somebody they already have established a relationship, mostly online relationships. And then they have 3 months to get married, but by the end of those 3 months, the guy in the US, often a US citizen, often a white US citizen, will kind of go like, change my mind, not, it's not going to happen. And so suddenly this woman is left in the US without status. So now she had status on her K visa, but now she has no status. She's had sex with this man that she thought she was going to marry, and then there are very few recourses or remedies available to her. And of course, going back would bring a lot of disgrace and shame. Separation, post-divorce separation, sexual assault, revenge porn. This happens in all groups. Being trafficked and pimped out, being outed or closeted by the LGBTQ partner. So again, these are in all communities. And as I referenced earlier, there's the undisclosed assault histories in home countries, and there's a lot of trauma associated with this, as you can expect. And then victim blaming is, intensified by using religion or culture, notions of honor-based crimes, all these different claims about how that really constellate around women's sexuality, and where patriarchal societies see it upon themselves to kind of, quote, patrol, cultural norms, and to claim and to identify what they determine are transgressions of sexual norms for women, and then as a result of that, and use religion and culture and honor to claim that women have transgressed certain cultural norms and therefore need to be punished or harmed because of that. So how victim blaming intensifies in culturally specific communities is a big issue that our advocates deal with. Okay, next. So I want to just focus for a moment here on refugees and immigrants. And the quote you see was made by the UN High Commissioner on Refugees. And this was, I think, by now, I don't know, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that in conflict zones, it is now more dangerous to be a woman than a combatant. So that just captures the high levels of trauma, danger, harm, violence that refugee communities particularly, and immigrants have experienced before coming here. So sexual assault can occur in, and does occur in, conflict zones, on transit routes, and in refugee camps. So with refugees, there's this understanding of triple trauma. So trauma occurs, and these are the sites of triple trauma. So trauma in the conflict zones, on the transit routes, and in refugee camps. And I just want to tell you that transit routes, people walk, 7-year-olds walk for miles, for days, for weeks, to get out of their home countries. Afghan youth have been walking out of Afghanistan to Europe because it's safer to try and leave and walk than to stay in the home country. So these transit routes are very, very dangerous and, of course, fraught with all kinds of problems, and including for women around sexual violence. And then in refugee camps are not places that people just stay at once their papers are being processed. People live in refugee camps for 10 years before they come to the US, or whichever country they move to. So people are in refugee camps for many years. Of course, the Palestinians have been in refugee camps for the longest. So for generations, there are now fourth generation Palestinians born in refugee camps, third generation Palestinians. And you can, as you might imagine, there are no services for sexual assault. There are certainly no SART teams, but people are trying to do something in those camps. So in the refugees, the communities that are in your various regions or states or counties, it's really important to understand this aspect of the sexual violence that they have endured. In disaster zones as well, there's high increases in sexual violence. In Japan during the earthquake, tsunami, and the triple disaster, the meltdown of the Fukushima plant, there was increased sexual violence. In Iran, in any country, there's a lot of increase in sexual violence amongst internally displaced people. In the US, there were large IDP populations after Katrina, and there was high degrees apparently of sexual violence during the camps and in that displacement. There's violence on immigration routes because people are coming, there are multiple transit countries, human smugglers, transport modes. So again, increased vulnerability. One issue that we see in camps may be that young girls may be forced to marry their rapist. And some of this comes from cultural norms where that happened in the home countries as well. It was a way to redeem family honor. And children could be raped or witness rapes. Again, that can happen in all countries, but for refugees, there's a much higher degree of exposure, including for boys who feel unable to protect female family members. And then there's also sexual assault risk from international and regional traffickers. So following disaster zones following disasters, often the traffickers move in and claim to be a kid's or a young person's uncle or auntie or their cousin, and they'll look after the kids until the parents are tracked and so on. But these are often traffickers who are coming in and then victimizing these children for sex trafficking. And then, of course, there's the sexual assault of ethnic minorities in their home countries by state actors. So for those of you where there are large Burmese populations, there's been a lot of, quote, sort of ethnic cleansing, or ethnic minorities within groups, have been violated and raped by soldiers. Because they're seen, the Rohingya, the Chin, they are all seen as the ethnic minorities within the home countries can also be victimized by state actors. Okay, and in this issue on refugees and conflict zones, violence is perpetrated both by state and non-state actors. All right, so elder abuse, there are no particular issues of sexual violence that are different for our communities, so I'm just gonna move on. Yes, next slide, please. And so how does the lifetime spiral inform practice? And firstly, it clearly shows that gender violence is historical. It's not accidental, it's not bad luck, bad judgment, it's not a single event. And I think that many of our advocates use the spiral as a tool for community outreach and education to make this very point, because it's a way to push back against the idea that gender violence just happened because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so what are the implications for advocacy? Firstly, it's of course listening without judging about what a survivor did or didn't do to, quote, cause an event, self-correcting when we do, calling out others if they do, and it's also a way for us to understand historical trauma. Next slide. So the second thing we see from the lifetime spiral is that there are many types of abuses that girls and women and gender non-conforming individuals experience or are vulnerable to at different stages and it can be in one stage or across multiple stages in their lifetime. And what this tells us for our practice is that we have to be careful in any of our work, in all of our work, that we're interviewing and not interrogating victims, and we're not probing for a history. So this lifetime spiral is, this analysis about gender violence is not about trying to insist that women tell us all the types of abuse they've experienced or to kind of probe for this history, or thinking that, you know, a survivor doesn't even know that this was abuse or doesn't even identify that as abuse. So it's really to keep us aware and mindful of the different types of abuses that may have been experienced over the lifetime, or that women and girls or family members have seen others exposed to, which increases their own vulnerability. So if your sister is being raped by your father and you're not, that vulnerability is also exposure. And of course, it's a different kind of exposure to the sister who's being raped, but that vulnerability has its own impacts, as you would no doubt see in your own work. Next slide, please. The third thing we see from the lifetime spiral is that there are various perpetrators located across the life course, and this is very true in sexual violence, sadly. So there can be incest perpetrated by father in childhood, digital abuse by boyfriend in school, sexual assault by a coach, by clergy, traffickers, buyers, and domestic violence by intimates, then the pressure by homophobic parents on their children, which isn't distinctly sexual assault, but is because of sexual orientation. So back to that definition of things that harm sexuality. And for elder abuse, you know, there can be sexual violence by caregivers. So if you have this exposure, whether you were directly a survivor or knew about others who were survivors over the life course, you know, there can be deeply internalized victim blaming with multiple exposure. So survivors, you know, can feel that it must have been their fault. If this keeps happening to them, there's something they're doing that's making this happen. So that repeated exposure really internalizes victim blaming more harshly. Next slide, please. So the last thing that we see from the lifetime spiral is about help seeking. And there's a fair amount of research and data that catalogs and concludes that past experiences influence current attempts. So by the time people come to our programs for help, they've not only had histories of sexual assault, but they've also had negative experiences of help-seeking behavior. And if you, again, think back on the lifetime spiral and where individuals could have gone to seek help, then how that would be impacted over the life course, how help seeking would be constrained because of all these different factors that you see here. So exposure to multiple forms of abuses and abusers shrinks the pool of potential helpers. Victim blaming and support for abusers by community and family members diminishes people's autonomy, increases abuser impunity, and it deepens the internalized evaluation because everybody's saying it's your fault or you deserve this. So again, coming back to how devaluation gets internalized. And then the negative actions and attitudes of helpers color survivors' ability to trust their own judgment, and that can increase the danger that they're exposed to, or that can create, and that of course creates enormous barriers to seeking help because they're not sure that somebody is going to come through. So our task becomes compounded by understanding that survivors have had very negative experiences of help seeking, especially around sexual violence, of course. And so our work becomes to mitigate that impact and to be able to sort of understand why they might be resistant or pushing back on the help that we're giving them. And in terms of societal oppressions, the impact of racism, poverty, sexism, how homophobia, how all this diminishes access and increases barriers to services is very, very clear in the work that we do. And then I'll just add in terms of the current moment of COVID-19, when it is being referenced or referred to as an Asian virus, or that has led to increased anti-Asian racism in today's context. So that's another barrier or another aspect, a layer of help seeking, that another factor that constrains help seeking in our communities now. Okay. Next slide. So here I just want to try and just capture some of that, what I've been talking about, how we so often hear, because if there isn't a clear understanding about lifetime exposure, lifetime trauma, help-seeking behavior, what are some of these what are some of these expectations of how sexual assault victims are supposed to respond, and how these responses, how we can understand them in the context of trauma-informed care. So I'm confident that all of you have had lots of training and exposure to trauma-informed care. I just want to capture it in that one kind of soundbite, that trauma-informed care is moving away from the approach of what's wrong with you to what happened, what was done to you. And that switch, just that framing, that different framing, is an enormous step in furthering trauma-informed care. So what are some of the responses that we can understand given the context that we've been talking about and I've been laying out? So typically fight or flight. Of course, we hear this a lot about assault survivors. Why didn't you flee? Hear this a lot about trafficking traffic survivors. Well, your pimp is dropping you off at the corner. You could have just taken a ride or gone somewhere or left or walked away. So why don't, so fight or flight is seen as the main two reactions to sexual assault or danger. But as we know, it's mostly freeze. So most people freeze when there's danger and a crisis looming. So fight, flight, or freeze are the three, is that sort of those are the three ways that our bodies react, and more often and more commonly, they react with freeze. The other issue I want to point out is the attachment to abuser. So most sexual assault is committed by people that are known to the survivor. There's not as much stranger danger as used to be emphasized, and you know this in your work. So that attachment to the abuser affects how somebody's going to be responding in a situation, in a help, when they're seeking help. And again, just using trafficking survivors as an example, many of them call their pimps daddy or boyfriend. If you think about intimate partner controlled trafficking, these terms, again, very clearly demonstrate the attachment to the person. And that attachment is, of course, mixed and contradictory and has so many different complications, but it helps us to see why survivors might be responding in ways that we don't anticipate. So protecting family honor. So there are obviously instances where survivors may have disclosed abuse, but then become silent or refused, they're protecting family honor. And so that silence can be understood as being self-protective if it's a family that has, or a culture, a community that has very clear sort of cultural freeze kind of attitudes about family honor, then silence is self-protective for that person. Denying or retracting statements, that happens in all communities, and that's obviously an example of somebody trying to have control over the process. Overlooking injuries can be a reminder for us to understand that people have a lot of ignorance or shame about their own bodies, and not disclosing their histories might be due to negative help-seeking experiences or a pileup of victim blaming. So oftentimes we may hear about the incident, but as advocates, then we're surprised that we didn't hear about the history. Okay, next slide, and that hands over to Jolene.
Oh, yes, it does. Thank you so much, Chick, for all of this. I'm going to be honest, I had a whole thing planned out for this next section about really trying to drive home how this relates to SARTs. And in listening to you today, I have even so many more questions and so many more thoughts that I hope that they come out coherent and really useful for folks, because everything keeps growing, and because there's so many different considerations. And so I'm going to kind of ramble for a little bit, and then I'm going to welcome it up to Chick, Sarah, and Fatima to join in and kind of share any kind of thoughts that really kind of come up for them. And so one of the reasons I was really excited about this webinar and being able to have this opportunity to work with Chick is this idea that probably for the past maybe 7 years, I've been an advocate for about 14, 15 years, but for about half of that now, I've really been thinking about how can our communities do better, promoting that culturally responsive service from all disciplines. And through that, there became a point about 7 years ago where I really started focusing in on that Asian Pacific Islander group, and really thinking about how so often it's a group that's invisible in so many communities. And if advocacy is having a hard time accessing folks, how are the other parts of the criminal justice system really meeting the needs of victim survivors? And even though I've been thinking about it for many years now, I still don't have that solid answer, because so many things come down to those unique fits within community. But there are so many ways that we will kind of talk about, at least little things to at least be considering, looking into, or ideas that your SART can really gather about. And so one of the things, so the second question is, how could better understanding the life spiral of sexual violence impact the way your SART views sexual violence? And at first, when I saw the PowerPoint, the PowerPoint deck that Chick and Sarah had sent, there's this moment where I'm like, is this something that will really interest SART leaders? So thinking about, is going through definitions and going through some of that basic stuff about what is sexual violence really going to be useful? And then the more I looked at it and the more I dug into it, I got so excited about it. I think that by really the way that that Chick was able to lay out this presentation today, I think it really built on, and throughout the entire time just kind of had me think about how does your entire lifespan and what are these potential implications for our teams, and thinking about, how will this impact both the way that victim survivors are willing to access mainstream healing services and access different forms of justice, but also what can we do better? And so one of the things I keep thinking about, and this is beyond this webinar, but one of my frustrations has been how so many sexual assault response teams within their mission statement talk about how they really want to respond to all forms of sexual violence. But then when you look at people's protocols and the way that they talk within meetings, they are only talking about penetrative sexual assault. And it's one of those things that I think is so limiting. So one of the very small takeaways that I got from this is really thinking about talking with your team about how does it handle all forms of sexual violence? Are reproductive violence treated in the same way? Is your team even equipped to handle like non-consensual dissemination of pornographic images? How are teams able to handle that? And what are we really serving? There's part of me that's like, if you are only going to be doing sexual assault, that is wonderful and a focus thing. But if your team is really saying that you want to work to end and respond to all forms of sexual violence, everything that Chick had talked about today needs to be covered and needs to be thought about, to at least be touched on. And I really think that by having that further understanding about how much violence and many different ways it can manifest, it can really help us have a stronger understanding of what trauma really is. And because when Chick was talking today, I was getting like a visceral reaction where I'm just like, how would I respond, if I was still doing direct advocacy or if I was on a SART and somebody came forward to me and wanted to talk about these things. And so I think that by having that stronger understanding, it's an understanding about what trauma looks like and then how that trauma impacts people with future victimization. And so I think that there's times where this is really useful when you're doing trainings, both multidisciplinary trainings and training specifically around law enforcement and prosecution. So really thinking about what are those investigative strategies. And I know that trauma-informed investigation is something that has been very hot for the past, 3 years or so. But truly, what does that mean, and what is that lived impact, and how are those strategies really being institutionalized within your SART, within written practice and protocol, within the ways that you interact with the community? And so just all these different thoughts right now. Does anybody else have anything to add on kind of that lifespan of violence and how that can impact a SART?
This is Chick. Jolene, do you want people to type into the chat? Or?
I would love it if people were typing in. I'd also love it if you happen to have any thoughts, or if Sarah or Fatima did, or else you're going to keep hearing me really excited about this work.
I think you should continue since, yeah.
Yep.
It really connects to I think connecting it to the SART teams is really important.
Yeah, and so there's so many different things that kind of came with this. I was also really getting pulled on this idea that one of the ways that people really need to be aware of is that idea about how does shame and ignorance really influence people's willingness to come forward within a community. And I think that there is this part of a lot of SARTs that I've been working with have been really wanting to reach into prevention. And I did a whole webinar before on my feelings about prevention, ways teams can do that. But one of the things that I think that is often overlooked within that work is that idea of how sexual health and sexual violence intersect, and how, especially especially when working with historically marginalized communities, sometimes one of the best ways to do it is through that sexual health lens, and to be able to help, especially if you're bringing in, if you're able to gain the respective elders within a community, how that can really influence the ability of youth and other people and other generations to be willing to talk about what sexual health is and what that looks like, and then to then help them really be able to better recognize what sexual violence is. And I think that that's one of the things that people often don't talk about.
This is Chick. I'd like to just come in on that point for a minute. So I do a whole training around advocate discomfort as a barrier to survivor disclosure. Because for the very reasons, for the very points you just made, Charlene, you know, that how do we deal as advocates with our own discomfort around sexuality? And then for immigrant and Asian advocates, the additional layers of sort of community, you know, scolding, if you will, you know, like, oh, you're so Americanized, you know, things like, you're so Americanized to be talking about sex, or we don't talk about this in our communities, things like that. So there are many ways that our own communities and as advocates, and then of course, from our own histories of exposure to our own trauma and assault, that we our own discomfort needs to be addressed. And many times when I'm doing a training on sexual violence, I'm always, especially in person, I'm trying to tease out, like, what are people's attitudes and to sexuality? What is sexuality like? You know, because all we hear about sex is how it's going to, you know, give you a disease, make you pregnant, how it's going to hurt, how it's going to be exploitative, but we never talk about the pleasures and the thrills and lust and all that, you know, sweating and pleasure and all that stuff, right? So it is important to be able to bring that, surface that piece too. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And so, yeah, so really thinking about, because this webinar is put on by OVW Rural Grant, and rural communities are really where my heart lies, I did want to take a minute to kind of think about, like, what are the nuances and how does this really manifest differently in rural communities? I came from a town in northern Minnesota that is about 1,500 people, with about 10% of that population being people who immigrated from Laos. And also we had about a 5% Native American population, which I was a part of. But that was really my view of rural diversity, is that there was a large Asian population within a community. But then, you know, I moved out from my hometown, and I really, as I started to work with so many communities across the country, I'm working with a lot of communities that have less than 1% of their population being Asian Pacific Islander. And I just want to note that, you know, your responsibility is very different based on things like that. And some of that you're able to find out, which is one of my things that I always want people to go back to, is what are your demographics? And right now, like with the census happening, is a time to really be promoting people capitalizing on that, and to really be thinking about, like, what does our community really look like? And yeah, and so it's also thinking about, like, so I'm thinking about the medical response. And in rural communities, especially for anybody, but especially for Asian Pacific Islander folk, would people feel comfortable going into the emergency room for a sexual assault exam? Is your community and your SART equipped if somebody's wanting to go to their primary care doctor, who they might feel more comfortable talking with? But a lot of SARTs I see, like, automatically shuffle people into the emergency room for a variety of very good reasons. But will that impact people's willingness to come forward? And so really thinking about all those little aspects of our response and thinking, are they trauma informed and are they culturally responsive? And this is another question that I'm really seeking to dive a lot deeper into over the next year or so, is really, what are the strategies for community trust building among specific population that your SART serves? I hear so many communities who are like, our SART created a brochure that was in a specific language. No one took it, no one reached out to us. We did all that we could do. And to me, I think that that is just a very harmful framework, both in the fact that I think that a lot of times people create written resources in different languages, but aren't fully able to support people who are coming forward through those languages. But also I think that it is doing the service because you're not really meeting people where they are. You're not seeking to build community and help to regain that trust, because there's a lot of communities who, for very valid reasons, might not want to come forward to the criminal legal system. Going to skip forward. As I said, I really think also that protocol revision is something that can be really important when you're thinking about serving different populations, and how from the very onset of how you formulate your protocol and the way that you view it. It should be centered around the needs of victim survivors versus this best case scenario checklist, which is what I often hear teams doing, is they picture the victim survivor that they see most often. In many communities, that's, you know, like a 20-year-old college student, and they center their protocol around that, rather than really meeting the needs of all victim survivors. I really think we need to be starting to be thinking about how you're increasing access to culturally specific services, even if they don't exist necessarily within your local community. What are resources available within your state, and what are those national resources that can really help victim survivors within your community? And as I'm hurrying along, Chick will be able to talk a little bit more about language access here in a minute and what that can really look like for communities. But I do want to underscore that one of the most important things is victim survivor engagement in this process. How is your SART really engaging with victim survivors, getting feedback on the services, but also how are you really thinking about them when you're creating practices and protocols? And I know that there are some SARTs that do things such as working on the state level to influence legislation and laws, and really thinking about, when you're trying to push for certain things, are you really meeting the needs of victim survivors? In Minnesota, there was a group that for a while had been wanting to create a law that would ban child marriage. But the issue with the way that they went about it is that they never talked with the communities who were practicing that. They were never talking with the people who had that happen. And so to not really engage with the community and talk to the people most impacted, you're really doing a disservice. And so thinking about those ways in everything that you do. And also, I always want people to think about who else should be a part of the conversation. And for a lot of people, that might be, are we talking to people's initial points of contact? And that might be different. What a faith leader might look like might be different for different communities, or who they really might need to be bringing in as their support person. So as you start really thinking about who could you be engaging with more, reaching out to, forming connections with, and how that will be moving forward.
Jolene, before you move any forward, any further, there's a question from Rebecca on the chat.
Oh, this is Chick. I'm typing the answer to that.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And so that is just a little very brief part about the SART work, and I would love to talk to people more about this. I just got way too excited in my conversation, and I want to give a few minutes though for Chick to be talking about the importance of language access.
Okay. I'm just finishing this response, sorry. Okay, so in terms of language access, I just wanted to say that for whatever, any training I do, I always want to bring in some clarification about language access and just a few reminders about interpretation. So very quickly, interpreters and bilingual speakers have very different skills and very different roles. So it's important not to conflate them. And if you are a bilingual speaker and say speak Tagalog or Mandarin or anything, Bahasa, any language, any Asian language that you can work with a survivor in, that's very important to have those skill set. And it's important to distinguish when you need an interpreter. So a person who's a bilingual speaker is not trained to be an interpreter. So I would really urge you all to get, and the Institute provides a lot of training on language access. So that can be also made available through SVJI if that seems useful. Interpretation is most often in consecutive mode, and that means the foreign language speaker says a couple of sentences, then stops, then the person interprets into English and vice versa. If you're a bilingual speaker and have to end up interpreting in some situations, please do not summarize, do not answer questions, but interpret everything. Use the first person, which means not saying, she said that her husband did X. So not using the third person, not summarizing. And if a survivor asks a question, say like, oh, what's counseling? Then not answering the question, just repeating what's counseling. It's very important that interpreters are trained and do not think that they have to use, quote, culturally acceptable ways of addressing sexual assault. Interpreters are also not cultural experts and should not be asked to give opinions or about cultural practices or meanings. Next. Many immigrant and deaf survivors do not know or use ASL. People who lose their hearing in later life don't know ASL. So please don't assume that they need sign language, so that they need ASL interpretation. And interpreters generally specialize in medical or court interpretation. If possible, learn to work with interpreters who are trained on the dynamics of sexual assault, so they become familiar with the dynamics. They know what vocabulary they need to prepare and understand. Lastly, it's important for all advocates, whether they're only English-speaking, monolingual, or bilingual, to be able to address poor interpretation in the system that they're working in. So I just want to end on a note next slide, please, that just to kind of ask ourselves, like, what kind of cultures do we want, you know, and remind ourselves that there's a lot of affirmative there are a lot of affirmative ways that we need to express what we want, and not only what we want to end, not just ending gender violence. Of course, we want to do that, but from the more affirmative perspective, we want cultures where gender democracy or gender equity, not gender violence, is the norm. We want cultures with constantly changing definitions of masculinity, of honor, of gender roles. We want cultures where communities take action to address the intersectionality of oppressions. And we want cultures where relationships of meaning replace relationships of power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chick. And we see that we are just a couple of minutes that are over time. And so we are not going to be able to answer any questions here on the call, but I do want people to feel very open and welcome to connect with us as presenters after the fact. And my contact information is on this slide. It will be sent out. This PowerPoint will also be sent out in the post-webinar resources that we will have out later this week. You can also be reaching out to Sarah at API, and she'll be able to help field any kind of your questions that you might have specific to working with Asian Pacific Islander victim survivors. And I can really help if you want more tangible ways rather than me just getting really excited about this work of how to incorporate things into your community and how into your SART, and how you can really be using the framework of centering the victim survivors to strengthen the work that we do. I do want to do a plug for our website of svji.org, which there'll be many more resources that are coming on there in the coming weeks, if not month, focusing on different frameworks for effective SART work, as well as some tools and resources around informational group interviews and focus groups and how to use those within your team. And I really want to thank both Chick and Sarah for helping to create this really wonderful webinar and for taking their time today. And that is all that I have to say. Is there anything you want to say as a closure, Chick?
No, I think I just want to end on that note of we want cultures of meaning to replace cultures of power.
All right. Anything you need to say, Sarah?
No, just thank you, everyone. That was really cool.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us again, and please be on the lookout for more webinars, and please once again, feel free to reach out with us or out to us for any other resources that you might need. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.